Is a research associate professor at South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology and the University of South Carolina. He focuses research on early history of Native Americans, particularly during the Mississippian period, which is AD 1000 to 1600. A warm welcome for Mr. King. Thank you, sir.
Can we cut up the lights on the screen? There we go. Just so you can see the pictures. Thank you for coming out today. Thank you for inviting me. Am I okay not speaking into the microphone? What's that? You want me to speak into the microphone? How's that? Okay. Smitty asked me to come and to talk about the work that I've been doing at the Etowah site, which is located in northern Georgia. And there are a couple of different things I'm going to do, because Smitty told me I had 3 hours to talk, right? I want to just introduce the site a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the history of the place, because the place was a town where people lived, and like any other town, it has a history of when people showed up, when they left, when it got big, when it got small. And then I want to talk about a couple of research projects that I've done that have taught us a little bit more about particular events in the history of the site. Who's been to Etowah? All right, so most of you won't even know if I'm lying. All right. So first, let's just situate this in terms of time and space and culture. We're talking about the Mississippian period, which is 1000 to 1600 AD. It's a time period. It's a cultural expression. People at this time period were organizing themselves in similar ways. They were growing a lot of corn. They were living in settled communities with hundreds to maybe thousands of people. They were building earthen platform mounds, sort of substructures like you might see the Maya temples on, except they're made out of dirt. And probably most interestingly for me is they actually had a ranked social structure. Now we think about the way our society works, and some people are more important than others and they're better off, and that's the way it is. It always wasn't that way with Native Americans or anybody else. And the Mississippian is a time when that way of doing things was institutionalized as a part of society. So there are elites, there are important people, and they live in special places, have special food, special clothing, and they run the show. It's also sort of a geographic extent, and you can see the white area. You could probably get 5 Mississippian archaeologists in a room and we would argue over whether any of this is really true or not, but you get the general idea. It does not go down below the panhandle though. Most of Florida doesn't fall into Mississippian necessarily, mostly because they weren't growing corn once you get below the panhandle. And you can see Etowah right there. I think I've got stolen from Google Maps, a location. Etowah is a state park. The state of Georgia owns it as a state park since 1953. And it's up there in the northwestern corner of Georgia, about 45 minutes from the hell that is Atlanta. This is the classic archaeologist map of the features of the site. This is just the main features. The site covers roughly 56 acres. At one point in the history of the site, there was a wall or a palisade that surrounded the whole thing. And there was a ditch on the outside of that wall, at least some of the way. It's situated along the Etowah River. There are 3 big earthen platform mounds and 3 smaller platform mounds. These borrow pits are places where they got the dirt to build the mound. So these mounds were built 1 basket load of dirt at a time. Dig it up, put it in a basket, carry it, dump it down. Most of these mounds grew over several generations. They weren't built all at once. And I'll talk a little bit about how some of this grew over time. So this is one of the bigger, not the biggest. Did I hear somebody say you had somebody from Cahokia? Yeah. So you heard about the biggest Mississippian place ever. Etowah is not it. It's smaller, but it's still a pretty big Mississippian place. Here's a drone image of the site as it exists today. Cahokia is kind of cool because they name all their mounds after people, the Kuhneman Mound and things like that. We've got Mound A, Mound B, Mound C, D, E, and F. So Mound A is the big one. That's about 64, 65 feet tall. It's probably the second or third biggest pile of dirt north of the Temple of the Sun and the Moon in Mexico City. So it's a big pile of dirt. These others are about 20 feet tall, and these that you can't even see up here, I'll show you in a second, are about 10 feet tall. There's the current museum right there, and this is the park boundary. It's all private property outside of, and I've of course discovered that the site continues way outside of the park boundary. And there's just a cool image of, that's the big mound, that's Mound A, and there's a big ramp running up the eastern face of it that has visitor access stairs on it. That's B right there. There's you notice the trees, they cut down the trees several years ago because they were falling over and tearing holes in the mound, creating erosional gullies, so they just cut all the trees off. I did some excavations in '94 and I found a clay staircase that went up the face of the ramp. So these are clay landings and there were log risers in between, about 20 feet wide, that goes up to the top of the mound. The back side of the mound, can you see that? It looks a little dark from here, but there's a couple of terraces. The farmer actually farmed this. He grew watermelons and cotton up here. There's an acre on top of the mound. And so he sort of smushed the two terraces and then cut another one so he could get his mules and eventually his tractor up there. But there's a couple of terraces on the back side of the mound. All right, D, E, and F. Do you see them? That's because they're plowed down. The Cherokee were removed in the 1830s, right, from this area, and it wasn't long after that people started farming it. It was farmed until 1952. And so those mounds have been plowed down and smushed out. And so bump, E, bump, now D, E, and F. And of course F is accentuated because the screen is bubbled out. But they're just smushed. There you can see it, right? There it is in the road. There's one, there's another one. There's not much. They're pretty messed up. There's Mound B, about 20 feet tall. And Mound C. Mound C is one we'll talk a little bit about because it turns out a lot of people were buried in there. It was excavated between 1880 and the 1960s, and in the process they found about 365 graves in there, with some of them with really, really fancy, well-made stuff, which I'll show you some images of, and that I'm going to draw on some. So it's been completely excavated and it's rebuilt, so that stands reconstructed at the site. Georgia didn't have the money to build it to its original size, so it's smaller than the original size, but it's reconstructed. There was a ditch that surrounded at least part of the site, and here's a piece of it right here. This is the widest part. We don't know how far it went toward the river, but it was part of, there was a wall on the inside of it, so it was fortified at one point in the history of the site. And then interestingly, as I'll tell you, after they fortified it, somebody burned down the wall and burned the community, so we know why they put up the wall in the first place, but it ultimately didn't stop them. So those are the pieces of the site. Now let me give you sort of a thumbnail sketch of the history of the place. And let me just say, this is a history that I've known about for maybe 15 years in terms of the broad brush, and then I'm going to come back and fill in some details. So we start out, and it was first occupied probably around 1000 to 1100 AD. And at that point, what we could see most clearly was there's a distribution of material right here along the river that dates to 1000 to 1100 AD. Mounds become a big deal because from the historic period working backwards, we figured out that mounds were symbols that chiefs or important people manipulated. They lived on top of them, they conducted ceremony on them, they were buried in them. They were earth symbols that they used to show how important they were. So when we see a mound, we think there's an important person there, and maybe this is the capital of something we would call a chiefdom, a community with rank social structure. So what we see at Etowah is Mound A is 64 feet tall. Nobody's dug anything on Mound A because it's so big. But what we found is right next to Mound A, there are a series of pits, they're craters that are filled back in with feasting material that dates to about 1000 AD. Those craters are borrow pits. So they're borrow pits, and they're filled back in with feasting material, so somebody's building a mound at 1000 AD. I know the history of the other mounds. This is the only one I don't know. So by extension, the earliest stages of Mound A were probably built at this time. And this is something fairly new for northern Georgia. Nobody really had done something like this before. So it's new in the area. Here's the Etowah River Valley, and here's Etowah. It's the only place like it at this time, the only place with a little mound. There are other community type things, but nothing like this. So it's something new that's established around 1000 AD, unlike anything that had been seen in the valley before. Jump forward to the next 100-year period, and we see, I've got good evidence that they started building the other mound, Mound B. So now we think we've got two little mounds. If you look in the Etowah River Valley, now Long Swamp and Horseshoe Bend, there are little mounds too. So now there are three of these towns with mounds in the Etowah River Valley. They were probably relatively independent communities. They probably had relationships back and forth. But the key is the idea of the way people were doing things at Etowah seems to spread up and down the river valley, and it's really spreading over a much wider area. And then something interesting happens. The place seems to be abandoned. There's nothing at the site that seems to date between 12 and maybe 1275, 1250. And if you look through the rest of the river valley, there really isn't anything either. If you look to the north, you look to the south, this is the Chattahoochee River that Atlanta has eaten up. So we don't know as much about the Chattahoochee. There are probably mounds in there too. But so something happens here that I don't know what happens, but they leave. But they don't leave for very long. And when people come back, Etowah really takes off. So maybe by 1250 to 1300, people return to Etowah. And then this Mound A, which was a little thing, is enormously expanded. In fact, most of the 64 feet was probably built during this early Wilbanks phase. Mound B was tripled in size, and they started building Mound C. So people come back, and they're devoting a lot of labor to building up the core of this place. And if you look in the Etowah River Valley, there's now a whole bunch of little mound sites right around Etowah. So people don't just come to Etowah, they come to the environs and set up a whole bunch of different communities. So it's like a whole bunch of people are drawn to this place. And it builds up pretty quickly. Probably Etowah is ruling over a big chunk of the river valley at this point. It's become something more important. Mound C becomes an elite mortuary facility. Special people are buried in it. There's my horrible picture of Mound C. This is a plan map of every feature that was excavated in Mound C. So take 3 dimensions of a mound and pancake it down. All of these squares and these things are here are all graves. So there's about 365 of those. These are walls that were built around different stages of the mound. So they would build the mound, bury people around it, bury people on top, then they would cover the whole thing over, do the same thing again, build a wall around it. So they did that through successive stages until this last stage out here with this ring here. So it's this continuous accumulation of people that are buried, and they're buried with some pretty amazing stuff. So here are just some images. These are pottery vessels. Actually, neither of these were made at Etowah. This is the Nashville area, and this is probably central Mississippi Valley. But this is a negative painted vessel. Have you heard of negative painting? They take a vessel, they might fire it, they might keep it green, they cover it with wax. And then you scrape the wax off in a design, then you coat the whole thing with a slip, and then you fire it. And the slip where there's no wax sticks to the pot. The slip where there is wax melts away. So what you end up with is this design on there. This one's negative painted with a couple of different colors. This is probably a gourd effigy. We find, there's one of those flint blades that I was talking about. These things are about this big, they're really thin. Talk about the skill it would take to make something like that. I can't even make a bullet arrowhead, and these folks are thinning something that came from a big piece of rock. These are called shell gorgets. A piece of the outer whorl of a conch or a whelk shell that probably came from the Gulf Coast, cut into a disc, and then engraved with designs. And I'll come back to this, but that thing right there is that thing right there. So we've got people making pretty elaborate stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about what we think the meaning of this is, but it's not just a Rolex, it's not a fancy thing, it's got some pretty deep meaning to it that connects to a series of themes that become important. Yeah?
How big were those round things?
They, about that big to about that big. This particular version, there are other gorgets that are much bigger, but these are pretty small. Which is even more amazing because shell is really hard to cut. And these aren't just engraved, but they're cut out. Imagine how many people broke before they got a good one.
They seem to be very accurate.
Well, and that's something people comment on pretty regularly. There's definitely some shared themes and shared ideas that are there. But when we look at the details of the style, when we look at the rules that guide how those images are actually created, they're really different. But you're right. I mean, this is a human with wings and a beak and bird feet. You can see his claws there. And that's something you do see in Central America too. Not exactly the same thing, but there are ideas going back and forth. That is really only about this big. It's about the size of a softball. It's made of wood. It's a head. It's a human head effigy without the lower jaw, and it's covered in copper foil. So they got copper from a river valley in North Carolina as a nugget. They hammered it into a foil, and then they wrapped it onto this thing. It's got shell teeth. Now, when you find a head without its lower jaw, that means it's a trophy head. It was taken as a trophy, and they cut the lower jaw off because the lower jaw was going to fall off eventually anyway. And so keep that in mind. That's a trophy head. It's a rattle. It's a piece of regalia.
Did that mean there was a skull first?
Well, it's representing a head is what it is, but there's not a skull in there. It's just wood. This is a copper plate, a piece of copper hammered thin. It's a bird. Unfortunately, it's folded. You're seeing the tail hanging down and a foot, and then somehow the head got squished over. The head should be up here, but you can see the crest and the beak and the eye. So this is hammered thin and embossed. So again, we're talking about people with crafting skills. That's not just they woke up one morning and decided to do this. These are skilled craftspeople. Here are some of the most amazing copper plates ever made. These are called the Rogan plates because John Rogan dug them up at Etowah. They're, again, a human figure with bird wings. He's got a mace in one hand, and you can't see it, but there's a human head right here, and there's a human head right here. So it's a raised mace and a human head kind of a thing. These, again, are about this big, copper foil that's embossed with that design. This thing is cool. It's an axe. It's a celt. Usually you find these things, the bit is made of stone, just like you see, and the haft is made of wood. You take a chunk of wood and you cut a notch in it and you wedge the bit into it. This is all made of one piece of stone. So they took a boulder in the round and broke it and carved it and polished it until it was that. The end of the bit is broken off. Do you suppose that was something that they used to chop down trees? No, that's a showpiece. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think that means. Probably the coolest brownstone things are the two statues that were found at Etowah. These are made of marble, about this big, completely carved in the round. You've got a male and you've got a female. You can't see it well, but there's red paint, there's white paint on the mouth, and then there's black paint. This is actually a glue. They probably were dressed, and it's not paint, it's a mastic of some kind. But the cool thing about this is the detail. All right, here they are from the side. He's got a hair bun, she's got a trunk line running down. You can see the detail on the ears. You go to the back. She's got a little backpack on, she's got a skirt on, and you flip them over and even their bottoms are carved. So these are things that are carved in the round. Again, the skill to make that is pretty impressive. So that's all in Mound C. You can see why people got so excited about Mound C, because there's a lot more really fancy stuff. If you jump ahead to the next time period, they continue putting that stuff in Mound C. They add stages to C, B, and A, and they establish this plaza here. They move houses out from the front of Mound A and then pave it over with clay and put a rock wall around it. And as far as I can tell, they sort of moved people even outside of this perimeter here. They finished the ditch and the palisade at this time, and you can see there are mound capitals on either end of the valley. In fact, this is probably the Atlanta of the 14th century. It's the biggest, most important place until you get to central Alabama, until you get to central South Carolina for a period of time. This is Etowah at its peak. And remember, this is after the place was abandoned, people return, and within a couple of generations, it's a huge place. And that's when, the end of this, the palisade wall is burned, houses are burned inside, there's evidence that there was a temple on top of Mound C that they got into and took the contents out and threw them down the side of the mound. Because we find broken pieces of people and sacred objects and stuff down the face of the ramp. So the place was attacked, it was sacked. The town was burned, and people left. They were gone for about 100 years. This is the site at its peak, probably a good representation. A, B, C, the plazas, residential zone, and then the wall around it, the Etowah River. It's abandoned. People are gone for about 100 years. While they're gone, this place up here on the Coosawattee River takes off. It becomes the new center of political gravity in the 15th century. It's called the Little Egypt site. When people finally return to Etowah, their good days are gone. They're just another town on the landscape that's dominated by that bigger place. But they build these 3 smaller mounds. The community's here, they use this mound, but they don't use these mounds. Hernando de Soto came through the southeast from 1539 to 1543. He spent the winter at Coosa, which is this thing right here. And after the winter of 1540, he came down, and because the Etowah River was at flood stage, he was stuck at a town called Etowah for 10 days, Etowah. And we do have some De Soto period chainmail, sword hilt, iron spike, things like that to indicate that De Soto was there. After De Soto, let's see if I get this right. After De Soto goes away, it doesn't take terribly long before everything changes in northern Georgia. European disease seems to have come in. We see evidence of people dying. We see mass graves. We see fewer sites. And then we actually, over time, can watch the sites move down the Coosa drainage into eastern Alabama, and these folks become the Upper Creeks. They become part of the Creek Confederacy. And so northern Georgia ends up being unoccupied for the 1600s, and then the Cherokee moved down in a little bit later. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of the history of Etowah. Very new place, nothing like it, but small, and then it's abandoned. People come back, and it's this enormous place that dominates a huge area. People attack it, it's abandoned again, and when people come back, it's just another town on the landscape until it's finally the end of the prehistoric version of Native America. Now, with that in mind, I want to jump to a couple of places in that history where I've done some work that's told us a little bit more about that. And the first one I want to talk about is the beginning of Etowah, that first established community. And it comes from remote sensing work that we've done at the site. That was part of, I'm pushing the wrong button, the Etowah Archaeogeophysical Survey, because everything has to have an impressive sounding name. We wanted to work with the Creeks because they're the ancestors of the people, the descendants of the people that built the place. The state of Georgia wanted them more involved in the work we were doing, and we wanted to do things that were less destructive. So remote sensing looks beneath the ground without actually digging it up. And we used a couple of different techniques. Electrical resistivity. Stick 2 probes in the ground, shoot a current between them. The degree to which that current is resisted tells you things about the density of the soil, the moisture of the soil, if there are things buried in there. So it gives you digital information about the soil beneath it. Flux gate gradiometer or magnetometer measures tiny little variations in the magnetism of that spot. It's not a metal detector, although it certainly detects metal. It's much more subtle than that. If you dig a hole and fill it back in and then run that gradiometer over it, where you dug the hole and filled it back in, it'll have a different magnetic signature. And so you can find different kinds of soil, you can find features, all those sorts of things. The ground penetrating radar is the one people probably have heard the most about. That shoots an electromagnetic wave down into the soil. It's reflected back. The speed at which it comes back, the strength at which the signal comes back, says things about, again, the density of the soil, the properties of the soil, and what's under there. So all of these tell us something about what's below the ground without actually digging. We had the most success with the gradiometer, or the magnetometer, and that measures subtle variation in magnetism. Now, you're not going to see a ton in this image, but here is the Etowah site. There's Mound A, Mound B, Mound C, the river. This is private property right below the site. It's a sod farm. And so all of these white spots are metal pump heads. When you get metal, it's so magnetic compared to everything else that it just makes a blind spot. It blanks it out. So the white is actually low magnetism, the dark is high magnetism, but when you get this metal, it just blows everything out. But you see pump heads and lines and things like that. Here on the site, what I want you to notice is, all right, there's a whole bunch of black lines here, there's some black squares there. All of that dark stuff are archaeological features that we can see in the magnetism. And when we looked through the data, and there are all sorts of different features, probably burial pits and hearths and things like that, these are the ones that we could see were the shape and size of houses. What we found in those data were 140 houses across the entire site. And something interesting about that is we could see two different kinds of magnetic signatures that we thought correlated with different kinds of buildings. So early on in the history of Etowah, they're building these things, wall trench buildings. And then later, they're putting the posts in individually. So a wall trench, I know that's a blurry picture, but you get the idea. You actually dig a trench, and then you take and you prefabricate a wall out of saplings. Lay down the saplings, lash them together, pick it up, stick it in your trench, do that on all four sides, tie it off at the top, and you have a building. And then there's a puddled clay hearth in the middle. When you burn something, it makes it more magnetic. So we were seeing a lot of this in our gradiometer data. It's a nice black outline, and then a black dot in the middle. So highly magnetic around the edge where the soil has been disturbed, and then highly magnetic in the middle. And we thought, hey, this looks like a wall trench building. And we were seeing things like this, which is just sort of a shotgun blast of magnetic highs and lows. These single set post buildings, they would put individual posts in the ground, then they would weave saplings in between and plaster it with clay, red clay, and it would dry hard. That red clay is red because there's iron in it. Iron is more magnetic, and so when those walls fall down, they create high magnetic signatures. So what we thought we saw here was these wall collapses from these daubed walls. We went out, I got some grant money, and we went out and we tested 9 of each of these different kinds of anomalies. So here's our thing that we thought was a wall trench building. There's my test unit, and there's the wall trench right there. It worked out. I couldn't have asked for it to work out any better. Here's another one. There's what we thought was a wall trench building. Ooh, you can't even see it. Trust me, there's a wall trench in there. So 8 of the 9 buildings that we thought we saw this sort of signature, they're a wall trench building. Those wall trench buildings, again, are built between 1000 and 1200 AD. So the point is, when we see this magnetic signature on the Etowah site, we know the kind of building and generally when it dates to. I don't have to dig up the whole Etowah site to be able to see the distribution of these kinds of buildings. We played the same game with these kinds. We put the test unit here. This is a collapsed daub wall. Remember, the single set post buildings are the only ones with daub walls. There's a standing post right there and another post right there. So it turned out to be exactly what I thought it would be. Here's another one. This is in the profile of the test unit, another collapsed wall, a post, a post, a post. So 9 out of 9 of these produced single set post buildings. So I feel really confident in being able to say, when it's this, it's a single set post building. When it's an outline, it's a wall trench building. And again, that allows me to look at the distribution of communities at different time periods at Etowah without digging it all up, which no one would let me do, and I would never live long enough to be able to do it anyway. When we look at the distribution, again, this is all buildings. When we look at those, if you actually modeled the buildings, this is what it would look like. If you took this and threw it on the landscape somewhere else, it would look like this. And you would say, hey, it's a little Mississippian village. Well, the interesting thing is Etowah is made up of a whole bunch of little Mississippian villages. It's like there are different little neighborhoods or different little sub-communities within this place at its founding. And that tells us something interesting about how this place was founded and how it worked. And it goes along very interestingly with something people have been talking about for a while. When we look at the pottery that's at the earliest Etowah, we find 3 different pottery recipes. It's not the decoration, but it's the recipe for the pottery, particularly the temper type that's mixed in. They're doing limestone here, they're doing limestone here, they're doing grit here. When Etowah is established, limestone, shell, and grit are all there at Etowah. So there's like 3 different recipes that come from 3 different areas. So the idea has always been that people came from the surrounding area, not just here, but all of this area, to found Etowah. Now you throw in the idea that there's a bunch of neighborhoods or sub-communities, and it makes it even more compelling, because if it was a bunch of different social groups that showed up to establish this place, they might maintain their own residential neighborhood. And so one of the things we learned from the gradiometer, first of all, is there were a lot more people here early on than I ever thought. Second, it really does look like they came from a bunch of different places and they each had their own neighborhood. And that, sets up a completely different sort of social dynamic, because now you get a whole bunch of different people from different places, their own sense of history, their own sense of who they are, and they're melding together to create this new thing. Excuse me. So that's one of the things we learned about the early end of Etowah. It's much more complicated, and it always is. When you're dealing with people, it's much more complicated than you ever thought. Now I want to jump to the fluorescence of Etowah, the peak of Etowah, and some of the things that I've learned about that peak. Remember, Etowah is bumping along at 1200 and then it's abandoned. And people come back 50 or 75 years later and it blows up and it becomes the most important place, and then it's abandoned again. So I'm talking about that fluorescence. There's a couple of things that I think we can see. One is that people, when the place was reoccupied after 1250, it wasn't just people from North Georgia. People came all the way from the Mississippi River Valley over here to Etowah. And they brought with them a set of images and a set of ideas that were melded with local traditions and used to justify a new ruling lineage. So Etowah was reestablished, but it wasn't the same old thing. It was something new that was sort of an amalgamation of foreign and local ideas. So here we go. Back to Mound C, the burial mound, with all the fancy stuff in it. It also has most of the foreign stuff that you find at the site. When I look at the sources where that foreign stuff came from, based on the form and style and decoration, it's either local stuff, North Georgia, East Tennessee, or it's coming from the central Mississippi River Valley. There's almost nothing from anywhere down in here or over here. It's all here or here. Now that could be trade, right? There could be trade connections that bring this stuff back and forth, so it doesn't have to be people. Some of the key things that came from that area are these copper plates. I said before that we can look at the details of the style, how things are executed, the rules that govern how images are executed, and be able to figure out what makes up that style, but also where it comes from. And what we know about this is called the classic Braden style. And what we know about it is it comes from the cultural milieu of the Cahokia site. That gigantic place over in the Mississippi River Valley. The classic Braden style probably was made around 1100 to 1150 AD. So those images were made around 1150 AD, and they were buried at Etowah 1250 or 1300. So not only are they from somewhere else, but people have been carrying them around for a long time. They're important objects. So we've got those two, but we've got other classic Braden imagery too. Other copper plates. This is called a bilobed arrow. That's a headdress piece. He's got it in his hair right there. He's got it in his hair right there. And people are buried at Etowah with it in their hair. And then this is, hey, look, it's a severed head. Again, we'll come back to the severed head. But there's also, beyond just the copper, these are pottery vessels that probably came out of the Mississippi Valley based on decoration, based on form. And these are shell gorgets that came from there. So it's not just copper plates, but it's shell gorgets and it's pottery vessels. This is a map again of the burials in Mound C. And these dots represent gorgets in graves. And I've got it divided out. The black dots represent local gorgets, and the multicolored dots represent gorgets from the central Mississippi Valley. Now, gorgets are interesting because they're generally associated with women and children. We think of them oftentimes as markers of lineage or clan or some sort of a family-based identity. And they're individual markers. You don't give somebody else your shell gorget. It's about you. It's not a trade item. So if a shell gorget from somewhere else shows up, in all likelihood, somebody came with it. And then also, it's interesting that the people from somewhere else are buried in their own section of the mound. The local people are buried in a separate section. It's like you've got different sort of cemeteries for different groups of people. On top of that, when you look at those fancy pottery vessels, those aren't drinking jugs. Those are things for ritual containers. Those are fancy things for special purposes. They're for ritual. When you look at those copper plates, they're part of regalia. People are buried with them on their head. They're buried with them on their chest. They're buried with them bundled up with other sacred objects at their feet. These are things that people use to conduct ritual. And so they go with the person who knows how to conduct ritual. So this stuff, all of this stuff, isn't moving on its own. It's moving with people. And so my idea is that we have the reestablishment of Etowah after 1250, and it's not just local people, but it's people from the central Mississippi Valley that come along too. And they bring a different set of ideas that comes out of these guys again, the Rogan plates. These plates were found in one of the earliest graves in Mount C, buried with a kid. I've pointed this out already, but some of the main features, it's a male figure as far as we can tell. He's got sort of a beak. He's got this mace, which is a war club, the severed head, this bilobed arrow, wings. So it's some sort of a bird composite. Now, I'm part of a working group that tries to understand the meaning of this imagery. And we work with Native Americans, we work with Native American mythology to try to figure this out. And I didn't do this work, but the argument goes that this is a particular supernatural, that there's great epic story that's told in the upper Midwest. Remember, these things came from that area. The Omaha, the Ponca, the Winnebago, people like that tell this story. And here's how the story goes. Before the world was created, there was sky and there was sea, or the beneath world, and they were diametrically opposed to one another, and they kept each other in balance. The creator, first man, was the sun in the sky. Periodically, he went down, every day when the sun set, he went down into the beneath world and he did battle with the monsters of the beneath world. When you lose, your head gets cut off. So one day he lost, and his head got cut off. When his head got cut off, he didn't come back up in the sky. The sun was gone. The balance in the world was gone. His sons, or a son and a nephew, went down to the beneath world. They defeated the powers of the beneath world. They got Dad's head. They brought it back up from the beneath world. They took it to the house of their mother, an earth woman kind of a person. And together they brought Dad back to life. Put the sun back in the sky, put things back in balance. When Dad came to life, he burst out of the woman's house, pushed sky and sea apart, and created room for earth, and creation was put into motion. So this guy, this family, the father and the sons, defeat powers of the beneath world, bring the sun back into the sky, and put creation into motion. So they're important people. So the idea is, this is the part of the story where this is Junior with Dad's head, bringing it back from the beneath world. Now there are a whole set of other images in other media that go through other pieces of the same epic in this classic Braden style. So that style tells different pieces of this story that we can still see being told now. So we call this guy Birdman, but think of, and it probably represents, in the same way that we think about God and Jesus and all of that as the same person and different people, this is first man, it's his sons, it's his sons' sons, they all have the same sort of powers and understanding. So this is an important dude, and he shows up at Etowah, right? And the people at Etowah start making their own version of this individual. They're doing it in shell gorgets. So here it's a figure, wings, got the beak, even got the fork design around the mouth. It's got bird claws, that's something new. And it's got this thing in its hand. But you can see they're riffing off of that. It's the same idea, but it's a slightly different version of it. When you put these two side by side, you see the parallels. All right, so it's a human bird figure, raised weapon, this in the hand, this in the hand, okay? Now, we think, since this is Junior bringing Dad's head back and he's putting the sun back in the sky, this is a metaphor for life triumphing over death, for day triumphing over night, which happens every day, and this guy is responsible for it. So this is the triumph of life over death, day over night. All right, this thing over here is the same idea. Hope I got the right slide in here. All right, what this guy's holding is that. And we're kind of goofed a little here, but all right. So you see that thing, right? There it is. Yeah. All right, segmented body, right there. Wing with dots. The tail comes out here, and he's got it by the nose. And he's got a blade raised up. Who's in the compromised situation here? That thing. That thing, people have looked at, and they've decided it's probably a moth. You know, moths and butterflies have the curly proboscis. But there's a particular kind of moth, the hawk moth or sphinx moth, which comes out at dusk, and it pollinates especially important medicine plants, datura and tobacco. It's a denizen of the night sky. The night sky is the same as the beneath world, or night. This guy is the sun, or the son of the sun. Do you see where it's saying the same thing? He is defeating the night sky. If this thing represents a being of the night sky, he's defeating it. And so he's rescuing day from night again. So the idea is it's a similar in terms of the image, but probably similar in terms of the theme and the meaning of it, in terms of what this individual does, but it's also something uniquely Etowah. They made it on their own terms. All right, so we got this Birdman that probably has these same sorts of associations. When we look in Mount C, the important people in Mount C are buried, decked out with Birdman symbols. All right, so the mace, this blade, and this celt are all different versions of the weapon that defeated the beneath world. Is that my phone buzzing back there?
Yeah, something's.
It's probably one of my kids trying to text me. Here we have the gorget with that flint blade, but there are people, a lot of people in Mount C buried with these same blades. Here's this hafted celt. And there are people buried with either the monolithic axe version, or this is made of copper. It's cold hammered copper. Copper is a soft metal. It's not a working weapon because it would be too soft. If you hit somebody on the head with it or you hit a tree with it, you'd probably break it. It's a showpiece. So people are buried with these as well. The head. We can see it here in this plate. This is other imagery from elsewhere. There's the head in a headdress. When we look at Etowah, there's our head again. Somebody was buried with that rattle. That's Dad's head. That's the sun being put back in the sky. Another person is actually buried with this mask. And the mask has no lower jaw on it. So it's like Dad brought back to life. You put the mask on, the lower jaw is there. We see people, here's the bilobed arrow, we see people with bilobed arrow headdresses. So people are being buried with symbols of the birdman. This is the fun one. This is a uniquely Etowah creation. It's a different kind of a headdress that shows up a little bit later at the site. It's feathers, it's got a leather cap, it's got a bone frame, it's got feathers, and it's got these little copper cutouts. Mace, arrow, feather. Mace, arrow, feather. So it's referring back to the key aspects of this figure. And so the idea is that what happens at Etowah is these people show up from somewhere else. And they bring this birdman imagery. The people at Etowah latch onto it, but they remake it in their own way. But a lot of important people are buried with pieces of imagery of this figure, probably because they're affiliating themselves with that figure. In other words, that birdman shows up and founds the new lineage, the new ruling lineage at Etowah. And the important people at Etowah claim to be descended from this person. Who's the sun in the sky? Who put creation into motion? Who rescues day from night? Who wouldn't want to be descended from that guy, right? But so now this fluorescence of Etowah happens in this interesting historical context where you've got contacts from elsewhere, new ideas coming in, and a new way of justifying rulership. How much time have I got?
Keep going.
Keep going? All right, well, I'll finish in my allotted time. Now, you're probably asking yourself, if I haven't beat you to death, why did people come from the Mississippi River Valley to Etowah? That's a nice little story, but why? Why would they do that? Here's this defunct site somewhere in the middle of Georgia, and they're going to go all the way from here over to there. And this has to do with Cahokia. Cahokia, the mother of all Mississippian sites. So here's Cahokia, there's Etowah. Cahokia coalesces and comes into existence at probably about 1050 AD. So Etowah is just that podunk place at 1050 AD, and Cahokia is a gigantic place. And that's when those Rogan copper plates were made. That's when that birdman imagery is made in the classic Braden style. By 1200, Cahokia is done. There are people there for another 100 years, but it's definitely on the decline. And so Etowah takes off after Cahokia has declined. So there's a temporal connection there. Now, let's go and look at Cahokia. Really interesting, when Cahokia comes into existence at about 1050, they see good evidence that people from all over the place gravitate to Cahokia. Just the same way we see other early cities draw people from the hinterland as they come into these new urban centers. That's exactly what's going on in Cahokia. It draws people in. And then, when Cahokia falls apart, they go home. So we see people going in these different directions again. And it's not just regular people. What we see at Cahokia, what it looks like at Cahokia, is there are a whole bunch of important families that live in that city. And what's happening is those important people are bailing out on this declining center. So they're going back to wherever they came from. So if we look at Etowah's foreign stuff, all right, the red is that classic Braden copper that was made around 1100. The blue are the gorgets that are made around 1250 that are here at the confluence region. The purple are some copper and pottery, which is sort of the Memphis area from 1250 on. And then we've got some stuff from Nashville that's 1250 and on. So we've got here at Etowah, we've got some stuff that's early from up here and stuff that's later from over here. So the idea is that what we're looking at is the movement, especially of important people, but the movement of people out of Cahokia. They're getting out of Dodge because the place has fallen apart. But they're important. And they've got their classic Braden copper plates, they've got their ritual regalia, their important families. So they go back to where they came from and continue to be important. And in that time, they take on some other ritual equipment that's contemporary with the time that they're there. So they've got their classic Braden plates that were made at 1100, and then they're showing up around here at 1250, and they're taking on some of the gorgets, they're taking on some of the ceramic vessels that are made at that time, and then they're going over this way. So there's sort of a two-step process, leaving Cahokia, going back to the Central Valley, and then going from the Central Valley and going eastward. And this isn't something that just we see at Etowah. We see it at Castellian Springs. We see it at the Hollywood site. We see it down here at Lake Jackson. So this is something that happens in a bunch of places. People from here go over here. And it's important people. And it's really probably important people looking for some place to continue to be important. And I know that sounds silly, but think about European history. Think about royal families relocating to new places and reviving ruling lines, taking over ruling lines. Read any Maya history, and there are all sorts of good records of the daughter of the king of Tikal went over here and established a new ruling line. You know, let's face it, important people are used to being important, and they will travel to be important. And I think that's what's going on here. You've got the fractioning of that big important place that was Cahokia. And you got all these important people with their cool stuff, and they go back to where they came from. And then they end up continuing eastward and settling or founding places further afield. And we see it at Etowah and other places. And that's how we end up with Etowah being established with that material and with people.
I'm just wondering if it's economics that caused the decline and then caused them to move to richer, perhaps agricultural areas. You talk about corn. Is corn central to all of this?
You know, it's debatable as to how important corn was at Cahokia. It's more important later on. But, you know, the American Bottom, that area of Cahokia is one of the most, you know, productive areas. And there isn't any indication that there was, well, let's put it this way. It's not until after Cahokia is gone, we start to see a series of droughts that hit a big chunk of the Midwest and Southeast, but it's in the late 1200s and 1300s. So Cahokia starts to go down before those droughts hit. And we think it's probably something else. It's socially driven more than it is economically driven. You know, we all have, you know, humans have a tendency to create these big things that get so big that they don't work anymore, and so top-heavy that they don't work anymore. And that's probably part of what's going on in Cahokia. It was just a social system that couldn't sustain itself, and it fell apart.